Our session 3 is titled Managing the New Economic World Order, the Rise of Asia. Joining us all the way from Singapore, please welcome the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Danny Quah.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to the Asia Society for this wonderful opportunity to get to speak to you. I'm here to talk about the New World Economic Order and the place of nations like Singapore, where I live and work now, in that order. You cannot talk about the New World Order without talking about China and the United States and their extent and still evolving geopolitical rivalry. I spent most of my working life in the United States or Great Britain, therefore transatlantic, but now I live and work in Singapore. I live and work in Southeast Asia. And if there's one point I want to communicate to you from the next few minutes I get to speak to you, it is this. The interests of Singapore and other nations outside China and the United States do not align with either those of China or the United States. The place of third nations, nations that are neither China nor the United States, is not easily characterized by attempting to align them with either of these two great powers. In Singapore and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, we are often asked by the great powers, when push comes to shove, when it comes to crunch time, whose side will you choose? Posing the question for us, third nations, in that way restricts the choice and agency that we have. It is a choice that identifies itself merely with alignment. It is a choice that we reject. So my goal this morning is to try and give you some flavor of what choices, what agency third nations like Singapore have in this world of geopolitical rivalry. I want to end up with some concrete implications for the things that third nations might do. But in this discussion, I want to look out in particular for relationships between nations that are positive, that is to say, mutually beneficial. Logic tells us, of course, that relationships can never be positive if they are part of a zero-sum game, if they are part of a configuration where one side wins only when the other side loses. Logic also tells us, however, that outside of zero-sum situations, for relationships to be positive, nations, the United States, China, Singapore, the United Kingdom, third nations, nations don't have to be friends. They don't have to be like-minded allies. They don't have to be contractual partners for relationships between them to be mutually beneficial. There don't have to be explicit collaborative agreements. It doesn't hurt, of course, when there are those, but outside of zero-sum situations, cross-nation relationships can be positive, even when nations are selfishly looking out only for their own self-interest. Relationships can be positive when one nation agrees to live by its principles and not align with either China or the United States. What we need are clear rules and a level playing field. What we need is rule of law. These conditions, rule of law, clear rules, a level playing field, are sufficient for the kinds of structures I want to share with you, but they're not necessary. Now, all this sounds quite abstract and conceptual, but I've tried to emphasize to you the principles by which nations like Singapore and elsewhere in the world outside of China and the United States seek to navigate this world of geopolitical rivalry between the two great powers. I want, by the end of the next few minutes I get to have with you, for us to have a view, a concrete view on what the rest of Asia want of the international system and how those objectives and actions matter for world order, even in the midst of US-China geostrategic rivalry. Put differently, I want to communicate to you by the end of these next few minutes I get to have with you, how third nations, those that are neither the United States nor China, can follow the principles that they wish to live by and still have agency for world order. Now, the way in which I'm going to do that, I need to take you on a journey with me. Because to be clear on what third nation agency means and what entails, I need to tell you why most of us think that the world is the opposite of the one that I'm going to draw for you. Most of us think that the world is one where third nations matter for world order in a world where the US and China are set on geopolitical rivalry. Third nations matter only in the most tangential and irrelevant of ways. Once we think that third nations don't matter, it is irrelevant what third nations want. If I believe that to be the case for the world, then the title for my talk would not be Managing the New Economic World Order, the Rise of Asia. It would be Managing the New Economic World Order, the United States and China, and the incredible irrelevance of the rise of Asia. Now, to be clear, when I say this, I don't mean this position to be patronizing. It is a position that is prevalent even in many third nations. So let's think about one way in which the world might operate, where what I'm going to say about third nations is really irrelevant. Let me paraphrase how a vision like that might occur. For the last 7 decades, America has enjoyed undisputed global dominance. Today, America sees challenge from an emerging rising power in China. Depending on the actions, choices, and guardrails selected by the two great powers, the United States and China, a spectrum of trajectories going forwards is possible for how the international system might evolve. The future is clouded on specifics. Which nation will emerge dominant if either one of them indeed does so? But all trajectories cluster in probability around paths of conflict between China and the United States. The rest of Asia, indeed all the rest of the world, is unable to shift the probability distribution of these outcomes in world order. Everything depends on just the actions of the United States and China. This is a vision of the world that I reject, and I want to tell you why I believe that. This is a depiction of the world that has two consequences. First, that in the world there is something called national power, and we can rank nations according to them. The U.S. has been at the top of that ranking for decades. China is now rapidly catching up with the number one. Second, this linear landscape of power is significant only for the political and economic consequences that one or other of the two lead nations take us on. Are the great powers democracies or authoritarian states? Do they favor national sovereignty, or do they instigate regime change upon others? What is their approach to multilateralism? What parts of the current international system do they support? What parts do they undermine? What policies do these competing great powers practice on speech and press freedoms, on individual rights and national priorities, on market intervention versus state control, on globalization, and here in Silicon Valley, on big tech? In those parts of Asia where I now live and work, the perennial question we hear from great powers and those convinced of this vision of the world is pretty much just, which side are you going to choose? The bolder among us who live in third nations will respond, don't keep asking us that question. You might not like our answer. In this perspective, for third nations, choice just means the same thing as alignment. This is not a vision of the world where the agency that we exercise at third nations is something we favor. This is a vision of the world that prioritizes and privileges only the great powers. We reject such a vision. What is the vision that I want to present to you then? What I've just described of the predominance of great power politics for the way world order emerges is one that has long assumed centrality in conversations like the one that you and I are now having. This is, after all, what the Greek writer Thucydides described 2,500 years ago when he wrote, "The strong do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must." Or long after that, when I was a graduate student, when the Harvard professor Kenneth Waltz wrote, "It is ridiculous to try and construct a theory of international politics based on small nations such as Malaysia or Costa Rica." This vision of the world is one that I reject, but now I need to tell you what alternative vision is available for us. So in finishing up this presentation I get to have with you, I want to do two things. First, I want to indicate how this hypothesis that the great powers are inelastic with respect to what third nations want is actually a depiction of the world that is unhelpful, misleading, and inaccurate. This is not to say that we shouldn't be discussing what the great powers want, but many of you in this room will have much more insight on what the United States and China are about than me, living and working in Singapore. But I can try and give you some insight onto what third nations would like to have. So that is the second thing I want to do in concluding my presentation. I want to help us prepare for the new conversations that we will need that not only endow third nations like mine with agency, but will also make for a more enduring and more stable international system. Because you see, if we focus on just the issues of contention between great powers like the United States and China, there is very little wiggle room that is available to us. Many of the great issues that are being presented now, held up as areas of contention between the great powers, are exactly zero-sum type of problems. Let me give you some examples. The lead example I can think of is what John F. Kennedy called the long twilight struggle, or what Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, called the most ancient cause of all. And this is the contention over freedom and democracy on the one hand, and tyranny and totalitarianism on the other. Here there's no wiggle room. It is a zero-sum game. One side demonizes the other, and you are either for us or against us. The proposition is binary, 0-1, win or lose. Here are a couple more examples. Who gets to write the rules of the game? Who is revisionist? Who is more sympathetic to market outcomes versus state control? And the last of these examples, we would like to carve up the world into, on the one hand, a coalition of the willing, friends and like-minded allies, and on the other, the alliance of authoritarian states. Now, in all these cases, the contention is zero-sum. It is binary. It is only 0-1. There is no room for compromise. There is no room for positive relationship. This is not the kind of world that this is not the kind of competition or contention that accepts either input or help from anybody else but the great powers themselves. Contention on Iran Kennedy type issues is not helpful to us, nor does it attract any appeal, nor are we third nations keen to participate in such a debate, because the best that we will be able to do there is align with one side or the other. But outside of these areas, there's a lot more space for the rise of Asia to help in managing the new world economic order. Because you see, while the great powers talk to each other in terms of these grand visions of 0-1 binariness, the reality is the great powers actually want to work with others. Harry Truman said that America totally defeated its enemies, but then brought them back to the community of nations. Henry Luce described the world of the 20th century as something that needed to resemble, to a significant degree, the American century. US-led globalization of the 1990s and early 2000s was about bringing the world together. And within the United States itself, the US Declaration of Independence refers to the consent of the governed as a fundamental principle by which leadership, either in domestic economies or in the international economy, attracts legitimacy. Soft power, the principle by which the United States has achieved predominance in the world, soft power has meaning only when the wielder of that soft power has an audience of third nations. That America has the great standing in the world today because America's values, its universities, its culture, its music, its movies, the hamburgers and the soft drinks that I see every time I come visit the United States, that this is attractive to others, needs others for this narrative to make sense. This is quite different from a narrative from the United States and China that focuses only on hard power, where the strength of your economy and your financial system and the sheer might of your military firepower have an objective reality independent of what we, third nations, can give to you in terms of being an admiring audience. The Economist newspaper described China's goals as seeking a world order that defers to states and their rulers. China's Belt Road Initiative is precisely about engaging with the rest of the world in a vision of global shared prosperity that you and I might disagree with, but it's nonetheless a vision that relies on the relationship, a positive relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship between a great power and third nations. Let me finish this discussion of great power elasticity by giving you a ludicrous example. Because time was this elasticity that the great powers paid attention to what third nations wanted, operated even between the United States and China. Sure, when I come to the United States and I engage with my American friends, we might well think of China as a dangerous place. We acknowledge that China actually is not littered with villages across the countryside where America has killed sons and daughters, husbands and wives through drone strikes and military disruption. There is no China filled with villages that fuel anti-American hatred and enmity. But nonetheless, we see China as being dangerous to America and to others in the world, because after all, China has killed tens of millions of its own people during the Cultural Revolution through purges, disruption, starvation. China has sought to export revolution across Southeast Asia. And in the midst of all of that great fear of China, the great McCarthyist supporter and communist hunter, Richard Nixon, reached out to China nonetheless, saying we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, threatens its neighbors. There's no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. China today is none of the dangerous things that China was when Richard Nixon wrote these words. China today is a lot friendlier to the rest of the world than we might have thought it was previously. So if between the two great powers, at a time different from today, there could be this elasticity, there could be the idea that collaboration could occur, wiggle room was present, the world was not zero-sum. So much more true it must be for third nations when we want to look for a way forwards, despite zero-sum thinking being the order of the day whenever China and the United States seem to get together. So in conclusion, let me tell you what third nations want. Third nations like Asia, the rest of Asia, want in the New World Economic Order. When great powers show elasticity, as I've argued they do today, as they've done in the past, there's room for exchange. My list of what third nations want and what I think great powers can provide is my own list. I encourage you all, no matter which part of the world you are from, that you've flown in to this amazing historic museum in Silicon Valley to have this conversation, make up your own list. I'm here for the rest of the day. I hope you and I get to challenge one another on what we think third nations want. Here's my list: peace and prosperity, multilateralism, a level playing field, clear rules of engagement, international rule of law, not abstract economic frameworks, but actual market access, trade agreements. And finally, national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and in ASEAN centrality, the ability that the rest of the world, including the great powers, must give ASEAN to determine its own destiny. And given what I've just described of the elasticity of great powers, of their own narrative to engage with the rest of the world and to have engaged with each other in the past, the price at which great powers will supply what third nations demand might fluctuate over time, but it is not infinite. In conclusion, let me summarize what I've tried to do for you this morning. I've tried to do 3 things. First, I have advanced the hypothesis to you that third nations have agency over world order. Our place in the world is not just to answer questions like, which side will you choose? Our agency in the world is not constrained by what great powers like the United States or China offer to us. Great powers are not inelastic. Second, I've explained why we typically think the opposite. We typically believe the hypothesis that third nations have no agency and great powers follow Thucydides in doing what they will, while the rest of us suffer what we must. I have given you examples why I think the actual reality supports the hypothesis of great power elasticity and agency of third nations, and therefore why it is appropriate that the title of this session focus on the rise of Asia in managing the New World economic order. Third, I have told you my list of what third nations want. I think what third nations want, what third nations demand, can feasibly be provided even in a world of US-China geostrategic rivalry. The price at which what third nations want can be supplied is not infinite. And this is a new world economic order that can come out even of the current US-China rhetoric on their geostrategic rivalry. The immediate payoff from these three things that I've tried to do for you today is that third nations will no longer be viewed as immaterial, a sideshow relative to what great power rivalry between the US and China will co-determine. That obviously matters greatly to us third nations. But more than that, I think that focusing on those domains where great powers can be elastic also lets the great powers themselves think about problem domains where their relationship with each other can be positive, even if not explicitly collaborative, but definitely not zero-sum. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Quah. We have time for two questions. Checked one. Can we have a mic run over to table 16, please? It's coming to you, Jack. It's coming to you.
Good morning, Professor Quah. So I have a question. It's just so about 300 years ago, Switzerland tried to use neutrality, right? Now, as you know, a lot of people try to compare the position and prosperity of Singapore as Switzerland. I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question, Jack. This is a theme of Singapore and Switzerland, exactly to say, but also of all small states in the world. And small states, interestingly, are actually the great majority of states in the world. People in the world, 80% of them live in neither the United States nor China. So when we consider the problem, the challenges that face Singapore or Switzerland, we're actually looking at challenges that face the great majority of the world. How we navigate this world is one where, for both Switzerland and Singapore, we set down our principles, we set down the things that matter to us, whether it's market access, peace and prosperity, stability, and we see what kind of leadership in the world is providing these attributes that we seek. It is these principles that we use to navigate our foreign policy, and these are the principles that I think have worked very well for both Switzerland and Singapore. It's not an interest-based approach to international relations, it's a principles-based one. Thank you.
Time for one last question. If not, okay.
There's a question here.
In the front row, Emerson, number 3, please.
Professor, thanks for your speech.
Emerson, a microphone's coming to you.
Professor, thank you so much. I was wondering, compared to national interest, freedom, or global obligation of a great power, which one matters more in today's world?
Thank you. So the question from Emerson is, the words you used were freedom and global obligations. Which one of these matters more? I think
national interest and
national
global.
interests. Yeah, I think from the perspective of third nations, it is wonderful that we lay out the values that drive each nation to try and achieve what it wants in the international domain. But we need to recognize that these values are not universal. They are not universally shared by all nations. And asking third nations in Asia to come down on one side of the other in terms of a values-based approach to international trade, to foreign policy, to security agreements is not productive. 80% of the world does not live by the principles that America espouses. Asking 80% of the world to behave in a way that hews to those values and is blind to how national differences lead for special and differential treatments is just not a productive way to proceed. Interpretations of freedom differ across the world. If we really believed in the rights of the individual, that individuals know best what works for them, we need to respect that nations and countries are different in how they approach these grand questions about values. Thank you.
Let's hear it for Professor Quah. Thank you. We really appreciate you coming all the way from Singapore. Thank you so much.